The morning my father was buried, the fog came in off the Pacific the way it always did in late October along that stretch of Sonoma County coast. Not dramatic, not theatrical, just a slow gray erasure that started somewhere above the cypress trees on the ridge and worked its way down the hillside in stages, swallowing the fence line first, then the barn, then the woodshop. Until by the time we gathered at the graveside you couldn't tell where the sky ended and the water began. The Pacific was out there somewhere past the hills, a mile and a half as the crow flew, and you could smell it even if you couldn't see it, salt and kelp and the particular cold that comes off open ocean in the fall, that makes the back of your throat feel like you've been breathing steel. I stood at the graveside in my black coat, the one with the lining that had been pulling loose at the left shoulder seam for 2 years, because I kept telling myself I'd take it to a tailor and never did. The coat was fine from the outside. Nobody could see the lining. That felt like something standing there, though I couldn't have said what. My father used to say that fog was the coast's way of keeping secrets. He said it the way he said most things, like he was the only person in the room who had thought about it carefully enough to have an opinion worth offering. He said it once and expected you to remember it forever, and because it was the kind of line that lodged in you whether you wanted it to or not, most of us did. Wade Collier was 63 years old when they put him in the ground at the cemetery outside Bodega Bay. The headstone wasn't in yet. They don't do headstones on the day of the burial, the ground needs time to settle. The funeral director had explained this to my mother in a voice calibrated for delivering practical information to grieving people. So there was just the casket and the lowering mechanism and the pastor whose name I kept forgetting even though I'd been introduced to him twice. And the small cluster of people who'd made the drive out from Sebastopol and Petaluma and, in my case, Portland. I was the one who held my mother's elbow through the service. She is small and white-haired and she had loved Wade Collier through 41 years of his particular way of existing in the world, and whatever that meant for her, whatever complicated private arithmetic she was running behind her eyes while the pastor spoke, I didn't ask about it. I just kept my hand under her elbow and watched the casket and listened to the wind move through the grass on the hillside. My sister Presley stood on the other side of the casket with her husband Garrett. She wore a black dress that fit like it had been made for a different occasion. Something with dim lighting and a bar cart, not a hillside burial in the November wind with mud on the path from the parking area. Garrett wore a suit that probably cost more than my monthly rent. He stood with his hands folded in front of him and his face arranged into an expression of appropriate solemnity, and he looked, as he often did, like a man who had studied how to be in rooms rather than learning it naturally. Presley didn't look at me once during the service. Not once in 45 minutes. I know because I kept checking. My name is Dallas Collier. I'm 34 years old. I've lived in Portland for 6 years in a 2-bedroom apartment on Alberta Street above a Vietnamese restaurant, and I work as a project coordinator for a mid-size civil engineering firm that does municipal infrastructure, roads, drainage systems, the unglamorous plumbing of cities that nobody thinks about until something fails. I am not wealthy. I drove a 2017 Civic with a cracked rear bumper to the Portland airport that morning, left it in long-term parking, flew into San Francisco Airport, and picked up a rental car that smelled like someone else's air freshener, and I drove up through the hills to Bodega Bay in that rental car with my window cracked because the air freshener was giving me a headache. I wore the same black coat I'd worn to my grandmother Magnolia's funeral 3 years before. Magnolia Collier had been my father's mother, and she had died at 81 in the bedroom of the Sebastopol house where she'd lived for the last decade of her life, and I had driven down from Portland for that funeral too, in the same coat, with the same shoulder seam already coming loose. She had been the person in our family I understood best, or who had seemed to understand me best, which is not always the same thing but in her case felt close to it. I remembered the morning of her funeral with a particular clarity, the way the kitchen in that house had smelled like coffee and something sweet she'd been baking the afternoon before she died, a smell that had no business still being in the air and was, which meant someone hadn't opened the windows and I was glad. I had sat at her kitchen table and I had not known what to do with my hands or my face, or the fact that the person who had always seemed to be the one steadying the center of our family was now the reason we were all there in that house without knowing what to do with ourselves. She had told me something at that table 3 years before that morning. Not at the funeral table, earlier, at the kitchen table on a visit when she was still well, or well enough, the kind of well that 60-year-old habits and a strong constitution can manufacture even when the body has started its own private negotiation with time. She had poured 2 cups of coffee without asking whether I wanted one, because she always made 2 and assumed you'd take yours, and she had put her hand over mine on the table, and she had said, "Dallas, your grandfather meant for this land to go to whoever was willing to stay close to it and understand what it is." He told me that, and I'm telling you now. That was always going to be you. I was 27. I didn't know what to do with that, so I nodded and I poured more coffee and I let it settle in the back of my chest in the place where things live that you don't have words for yet. She had said other things that afternoon too, things I hadn't understood the weight of until later. She'd said that your grandfather built something and your father carried it, and the question now was whether what got carried forward was the land or just the idea of the land, and those were 2 different things. She'd said that Presley was her granddaughter and she loved her without reservation, but that Presley had always loved the idea of things more than the things themselves, and that was a fine way to be in the world except when the thing in question was a piece of land that needed tending. She'd said, "Land doesn't care about ideas. It cares about whether someone showed up." I had thought about that conversation many times since she died. I thought about it standing at her graveside in this same coat. I thought about it now, standing at my father's graveside 3 years later, in the fog, while the pastor's words moved through the November air without quite landing on anything. The house was the thing. It had always been the thing, and anyone who had spent more than a few hours in the orbit of the Collier family knew it. The property sat on 2.5 acres in the hills outside Sebastopol, not the tourist version of Sonoma County, not the Napa-adjacent wine country postcard version, but the older, quieter version of that landscape where the oak trees grow sideways from the prevailing wind and the soil is dark red and smells like iron after rain and the roads don't have shoulders. My grandfather had built the main house in 1961, a long low structure with a covered porch running the full length of the front and a stone fireplace in the living room that he'd laid himself over the course of one summer. My father had inherited it when my grandfather died, and he had improved it slowly over 3 decades, added the barn, converted half of it into a woodworking shop where he made furniture that he sometimes sold and more often kept, put in a new well in 2004, regraded the driveway after the big rain year washed out the upper section. By the time my father died, the county assessed the property at just under $1.4 million. The land alone, 2.5 acres in Sonoma County, with water rights and road access and that view of the western ridge, was worth more than anything else our family had ever touched or would likely touch again. My father had made a trust. That much I knew. He'd had an estate attorney, a man named Horowitz, out of a small office in downtown Santa Rosa, draw up a revocable living trust in 2019. The trust named me as the primary beneficiary of the Sebastopol property. I knew this because my father had told me, in the way he told me most significant things, once briefly with no ceremony, as if the information were a simple fact about the world rather than something that required acknowledgement or discussion. We'd been standing in the woodshop. He was fitting a drawer pull on a side table he'd been building for months, cherry wood, hand-cut dovetails, the kind of piece that represented a level of patience and craft I had always respected in him even when I couldn't respect much else. He said, without looking up from the drawer, "I've got the property squared away for you in the trust. Talk to Horowitz if anything happens." Then he went back to the drawer pull. That was 14 months before he died. I had not told Presley. My father had not told Presley as far as I knew. Whether his silence on that point was a kindness or a cowardice I had spent the subsequent months unable to fully determine. He had been skilled at managing what each of us knew. It was not the same skill as honesty, and it was not the same skill as cruelty. It was something in between, something that served him and cost others, and I had spent enough years naming it to know that naming it changed nothing about the shape it left in people. The reception after the burial was held at the Sebastopol house. That was where receptions in our family had always been held, because the house was where things happened. It was the gravitational center, the place you returned to whether you wanted to or not. I drove my mother up from Bodega Bay in the rental car, through the back roads that wound through the hills with the oak trees pressing in on either side, while she held a folded handkerchief against her mouth and didn't speak. The fog had thinned by then, burned back a little by a pale afternoon sun, and the light on the hills was the color of old brass. Presley and Garrett followed in their Audi. There were perhaps 30 people who came back to the house. Neighbors from the surrounding properties, a few of my father's woodworking acquaintances, men in their 50s and 60s who had traded joinery techniques with him over the years and who stood in the living room holding their plates and talking about him in the careful, fond, selective way that people talk about the dead at these gatherings. A couple from my parents' church in Petaluma, a woman named Dora and her husband whose name I couldn't hold on to, who had the particular gift of practical kindness, setting out food, refilling glasses, quietly removing empty plates. My father's younger brother Cade, who had driven up from San Jose and smelled faintly of cigarettes and had brought a supermarket fruit tray in a plastic container that sat on the kitchen counter looking uncertain of itself for the entire afternoon. I moved through those hours the way you move through the early hours after a burial. Not quite fully present, not quite absent. Present enough to accept condolences and refill glasses and locate the extra paper towels when someone knocked over a water glass near the fireplace, but operating at one remove from the full weight of what the day meant, as though the meaning were something I was setting aside to deal with later when the house was quiet. My mother sat in her chair by the window, the chair she always sat in, the one with the high back that she'd had reupholstered twice, and Magnolia's old quilt was folded over the arm of it the way it always was, the double wedding ring pattern faded from years of handling, and people came to my mother in a steady, gentle procession. And I watched her face from across the room and thought about how grief looked different on different people, and that on my mother it looked like a door held very carefully shut. Presley orbited the room. That was the word that kept coming to me, orbited. She moved in a wide, careful circuit, pausing to speak to Cade, pausing to speak to the church couple, touching Garrett's arm every 20 minutes with a light proprietary steadiness, as though checking that he was still there. She and I had spoken perhaps 40 words to each other since I'd arrived the night before. We had never been close, not as children, not as adults, and the distance between us was partly temperament and partly the specific architecture of our father's parenting, which had involved a quiet, consistent practice of setting us against each other in ways that were hard to name in the moment. He praised Presley's choices to me and my choices to Presley, and over years of that, each of us had developed a slightly false picture of what the other thought and felt. It was a kind of management. It took skill. My father had been skilled at it. I found Cade near the kitchen doorway around 2 in the afternoon. He was holding a glass of water and looking at the woodshop through the back window. The doors were closed, the way they'd been closed all day, and the afternoon light was starting to move off the western side of the property. "She's been out here a lot," he said, without turning to look at me. He meant Presley. He spoke in the way he spoke most things, low, oblique, like he was offering a piece of information and leaving it to you to decide what to do with it. "Since when?" I asked. "August. September." He looked at the glass in his hand. "Your dad called me once in September. Asked me some questions about whether you could undo a trust after you'd already set one up. Whether you needed a lawyer or whether you could just file something." He paused. I told him I didn't know, that it sounded like a lawyer question. He said right and changed the subject. I looked at him. His face was tired and neutral in the way of a man who is not trying to tell you what to think, just what he observed. "Why didn't you call me?" I said. He looked at the woodshop. "Didn't know what I was looking at," he said. "Still not sure I do." He took a drink of water. "I'm telling you now." He moved off a few minutes later, back toward the fruit tray he hadn't touched, and I stood at the kitchen doorway and thought about September. My father calling Cade, his younger brother, a man who managed inventory for a mid-size hardware distributor and had no legal expertise, to ask whether you could undo a trust without a lawyer. Not calling Horowitz, who had drawn the trust and whose number was presumably in his contacts. Not calling me. Cade. The question was, had my father been asking because he wanted to undo it himself, or because someone had suggested he should be able to? I filed the question in the place where I kept things I couldn't yet answer. There were already several things in that place by the time the reception started thinning, and by the time Dora had taken my mother gently upstairs, there were a few more. By 4 in the afternoon the house had mostly emptied. Dora had taken my mother upstairs with a firmness that was also a kindness, the kind of help that doesn't ask permission because it knows permission won't be given. Cade had left. He'd driven back toward the highway with his supermarket fruit tray, or what remained of it, which was still most of it. The grapes had taken some damage. The woodworking acquaintances had filed out in a slow, unhurried procession, shaking hands in the driveway, headlights coming on as the fog started to reclaim the lower portions of the property. I was at the kitchen sink rinsing the last of the glasses, the water running cold because the hot water in that house had always taken 45 seconds to arrive and I hadn't waited for it, when I heard Presley come into the kitchen behind me. I didn't turn around. I heard her set something on the table. A flat sound, paper or an envelope, placed deliberately rather than dropped. "Dallas," she said. I turned off the water. I dried my hands on the dish towel that hung from the oven handle, the old blue-striped one that had been there since I was in high school. I turned around. She was standing at the far end of the kitchen table, and her right hand was resting on a manila envelope, and her face had settled into an expression I couldn't immediately name. It wasn't grief. It wasn't the careful neutral politeness she'd been maintaining all afternoon. It was something more deliberate than either, something that had been prepared in advance. "I need you to see something," she said. I walked to the table. The envelope was legal size, standard manila, already opened, the brass clasp bent back, the flap folded over. No address on the outside. No postage. Just a rectangular ink stamp in the upper left corner, Sonoma County Recorder's Office. My stomach registered something before my mind did. A tightening. A shift in the atmosphere of the room. "What is this?" I asked. "It's the deed to the house," Presley said. Her voice was level. Practiced sounding in a way I didn't like. "Dad signed it over to me. He did it 3 weeks ago before he went into the hospital. He was lucid. He was clear about what he wanted." She paused. "He wanted me and Garrett to have the property. He told me so directly. He said he'd been thinking about it for a long time and that we were the ones positioned to take care of it." I looked at her. The steadiness of her eyes was the thing I kept returning to, the quality of someone who has rehearsed and knows the material. "He had a trust," I said. "The trust was outdated," she said. "His wishes changed. The deed transfer reflects what he actually wanted, and it supersedes the trust. I had an attorney review it." Something moved through my chest, not a named thing, just a physical shift, the sensation of stepping onto ground you believed was solid and finding a fraction of give beneath your foot that shouldn't be there, a compression that telegraphs something wrong with the surface before your mind has finished processing it. I kept my hands at my sides. I kept them still. "When was it recorded?" I asked. Presley moved her hand from the envelope. She squared her shoulders by a small, careful degree. "Before he passed," she said. "Recently." "When specifically?" "Dallas, today is not." "Presley." My voice stayed flat and even. "When was the deed recorded with the county?" She picked up the envelope and extended it toward me. "It's all in there," she said. "Read it yourself." I took the envelope. I reached inside. My fingers found the document, heavy stock paper, the kind county offices use, with a slightly waxy, processed texture from the official handling. I drew it out slowly. I unfolded it on the table, smoothed the top crease with the flat of my palm, and read the header. Grant Deed. County of Sonoma, State of California. Grantor line, Wade Arthur Collier. Grantee line, Presley Marie Collier Dade and Garrett Philip Dade, husband and wife, as joint tenants. Property description block, the parcel number I recognized, the acreage, the Sebastopol address I had been coming to my entire life. And in the upper right corner, the recording date stamp from the county recorder's office. I read it once. I read it again. "Presley," I said. "This was recorded 8 days ago." "Yes. Dad was admitted to the hospital 14 days ago. He was on supplemental oxygen by the 3rd day. He was never discharged." "He signed the deed before he went into the hospital," she said. "The signing date and the recording date are 2 separate things." "I know they're 2 separate things," I said. "That's exactly what I'm asking about. Someone filed this with the county 8 days ago, while Dad was in the hospital on oxygen. Who filed it?" "I did," Presley said. "Because that's when I had everything in order to file it. The signing happened before the hospitalization. The notarization date is on the signature page." I turned to the signature page. The notary stamp was there, a California notary, a name I didn't recognize, an address in Sebastopol. The notarization date was 17 days ago. 3 days before my father's hospitalization. My father's signature was at the bottom, in the compressed upright cursive he'd used his whole adult life. The capital W in Wade looped back on itself in the way I had seen on birthday cards and checks and Christmas letters my whole life. It looked like his signature. I stood with my palms flat on the document and I looked at that signature, and I thought about 14 months ago in the woodshop, the drawer pull, talk to Horowitz if anything happens. I thought about Magnolia at the kitchen table with her hand over mine. I thought about Kate at the kitchen doorway an hour ago, asked me some questions about whether you could undo a trust, and about the 3 days between that notarization date and my father's hospitalization. 3 days in which, according to this document, my father had sat with a notary and signed over a $1.4 million property to my sister and her husband, after spending 14 months with a trust in place that named me as the primary beneficiary, without calling me, without telling me, without any conversation I could account for. I thought about all of it. My voice stayed steady. "I'm going to need to contact Horowitz," I said. "You can do that," Presley said. "That's your right. But this document is legal, Dallas. This is what Dad decided. I'm not going to apologize for honoring what he wanted." I looked up at her. Her chin was lifted slightly. Behind her, Garrett had appeared in the kitchen doorway without my hearing him enter. He had a way of materializing at moments like this, of being present at the periphery. He was leaning against the doorframe with his hands in his trouser pockets, looking at a point approximately 18 inches to the left of the actual scene, performing non-involvement. "Does Mom know?" I asked. Something moved across Presley's face. Brief. A flicker that resolved back into the prepared steadiness before I could read it fully. "Dad communicated his wishes to Mom," she said. "That isn't what I asked you. Dallas, does our mother know that you filed this deed transfer 8 days ago while Dad was in the hospital?" Presley's jaw moved. Her voice, when she answered, had dropped into something quieter and more controlled that I liked considerably less than the steady version. "I'm asking you," she said, "to take tonight, to sleep. We've all had a long, hard day and there is a lot of grief in this house right now, and I don't think either of us is served by turning this into a confrontation at the end of it." I wanted to answer that. Several answers were available. I counted the pause instead of speaking them. I gathered the pages of the deed document, aligned them carefully against each other, and slid them back into the manila envelope. I set the envelope on the table. I rested my hand on it for one moment, flat, feeling the paper through the envelope, feeling the edges of the document inside. Then I lifted my hand. "I'll need to keep this copy," I said. "That is your copy," Presley said. "I have mine." I picked up the envelope. I walked to the counter beside the refrigerator where I'd left my phone, face up, next to my keys. I set the envelope down there. And that was when the phone screen lit up with an incoming call. The caller ID read, "Sonoma County Recorder, Public Services." I looked at it for a moment. A county recorder's office. On a Friday. After 4 in the afternoon. Behind me, Presley had resumed speaking. Something about giving it time. Something about how these decisions don't have to be made today, and grief makes everything feel more urgent than it is. Garrett's voice came in underneath hers, low, a murmured agreement. I picked up the phone. I answered. "Sonoma County Recorder's Office, Public Services Line, this is Anita Reyes. Am I speaking with Dallas Collier?" The voice was unhurried and professional. A middle-register woman's voice with the particular cadence of someone who spends her working hours explaining things clearly to people who are stressed. "Yes," I said. "This is Dallas Collier. Ms. Collier, I apologize for calling late in the day. I want to be upfront with you about why I'm calling and give you time to follow up through the appropriate channels." A pause, the professional kind, not the kind that signals uncertainty, but the kind that means I have prepared this and I am choosing my words. Our office received a deed transfer filing approximately 8 days ago regarding a residential property in Sebastopol. Parcel number 072-381-004. Are you familiar with that parcel? My hand on the counter was very still. Behind me, Presley had stopped talking. I could feel the quality of the silence in the kitchen change, a new attention entering it, a held breath. "Yes," I said. "I'm familiar with it. We also have on file a trust instrument from 2019 listing you as a primary beneficiary of that parcel. When a deed transfer is filed that potentially conflicts with an existing trust instrument, our office has a standard procedure. We flag the discrepancy for a courtesy notification to all parties of record." Another small pause. "Ms. Collier, I want to be careful about what I say over the phone, because you'll want to get proper legal advice. But I can tell you that our office has flagged some questions about the timing and circumstances of this filing that we'll need to document before the transfer is finalized in our system. The room was very quiet. The refrigerator made its low, constant sound. Outside, through the window above the sink, the last of the afternoon light was leaving the sky over the western ridge. "What kind of questions?" I said. "The grantor on the deed, Wade Collier. There's a discrepancy between the notarization date on the document and some information we received regarding his medical status around that time. I'm not in a position to say more than that on the phone. But I would strongly encourage you to contact an attorney before the close of business Monday, and to request a certified copy of the full deed filing from our office, because you will want it in hand for any legal review." "The recording date on the deed," I said. "It's 8 days ago." "That's correct. And the notarization on the signature page is 17 days ago." A brief pause. "That is also correct. Ms. Reyes." I kept my voice level, quiet, even. "Is a 9-day gap between notarization and filing unusual?" "It is not inherently unusual," she said. "Documents are sometimes held before filing for various reasons. But in combination with the other discrepancies our office has flagged, it is part of the picture we're looking at." "What other discrepancies?" I said. "Ms. Collier, I'm not able to go into specifics on a phone call. What I can tell you is that this transfer has not fully cleared our review process, and it won't until these questions are resolved. Our document review department has placed a notation in the parcels file." I looked at the window. The fog was fully in now over the ridge, the last of the pale November light disappearing into it. "When you say the transfer hasn't fully cleared, does that mean it can still be contested within a window?" "I'd encourage you to direct that question to your attorney," she said. "What I can say is that a notation in a parcel file creates a record. Any title search conducted on that property will surface the notation and the flagged discrepancy. Any subsequent legal action will have that record to work from." "I understand," I said. "I appreciate the call." "Of course. You can reach our office Monday morning. Ask for the document review department. Reference that parcel number." "I will," I said. "Thank you, Ms. Reyes." I ended the call. I set the phone down on the counter next to the envelope. The kitchen was very quiet. I turned around. Presley was standing 2 feet behind me. The color in her face had changed, not dramatically, not the way it would if she were performing a reaction, but in the subtle involuntary way that happens when something lands that you weren't prepared for, when the room does not respond the way the rehearsal said it would. Garrett was still in the doorway, but his posture had shifted. His hands had come out of his pockets. "Who was that?" Presley said. Not a question. The shape of one without the openness. I picked up the manila envelope from the counter. "The county recorder's office," I said. I watched her face. I let the silence do what it needed to do. "Understood," I said, and let it land like a period, not a comma. I set the envelope under my arm, smoothed one hand across the front of my coat, and walked out of the kitchen into the hallway toward the stairs. Behind me I heard Garrett say her name. Low. Urgent. The sound of a man recalculating. I didn't stop. I went upstairs and sat on the edge of the bed in the room that had been mine growing up, the one at the end of the hall with the window that faced the western ridge, the one that still had a small brass hook on the back of the door where I used to hang my backpack. The hook had been there since I was 11. My father had put it up with 2 screws and a level, making a production of the level, showing me how to use it, as though a brass hook were a lesson. That was how he did most things. Instruction wrapped around a simple task, the instruction being more about his competence than about mine. I sat on the edge of the bed and I looked at the manila envelope in my hands and I thought about what Anita Reyes had said and what she had not said. About the notation in the parcel file. About any title search surfacing the flagged discrepancy. About the 9 days between the notarization date and the recording date, and about Presley's face in the moment after the call ended. Then I set the envelope on the nightstand and I lay back on the bed with my coat still on and I looked at the ceiling and I let the room be quiet for a while. My mother's house sounds at night, the furnace clicking on in the basement, the third stair from the top settling the way it had settled my whole life, the wind off the ridge finding the gap in the kitchen window frame that my father had been meaning to recaulk for approximately 11 years. I knew these sounds the way you know the sounds of a place that held your whole childhood, not consciously, just as the texture of what quiet meant in that particular building. I didn't sleep. At 7:15 I heard voices downstairs. Presley and Garrett, low and continuous, the murmur of a conversation being held carefully, which is different from the murmur of a conversation held quietly. Careful is when you know someone might be listening. I lay still and I listened to the tone of it without being able to make out the words, and after about 10 minutes it stopped, and I heard the back door open and close. I got up. I went to the window. Garrett was in the driveway below, standing beside the Audi with his phone to his ear. I watched him for a moment. The way he was standing, weight shifted onto one foot, free hand moving in the air in front of him the way people gesture when they are explaining something that needs explaining. He was on that call for 4 minutes. I know because I counted. When he went back inside, I left the window. I didn't go back to bed. I put on my shoes and I went out into the hallway and I knocked on my mother's door. She was still awake. I had known she would be. There was a line of light under the door, and the particular quality of the silence in that room that is different from sleeping silence. She said, "Come in," and I came in and sat in the old wingback chair beside her bed, the one with the fabric worn smooth on both armrests from decades of use, and she looked at me and I looked at her and neither of us said anything for a moment. Her face in the lamplight was tired in the way that isn't about one night's sleep. 41 years of managing your face in a room with Wade Collier had given her a particular competence with expression. Not a false competence, just a real one, the kind that comes from long practice with someone who read your reactions and filed them away. She had learned to hold what she felt at a slight remove from what she showed, and tonight that practice looked less like a habit and more like exhaustion. "I need to ask you something," I said. "All right." In the months before Dad went into the hospital, did you notice anything different about how he managed money? Bills, transfers, anything like that? My mother considered the question with the careful attention she gave to things she had already thought about. "He let me handle more of it," she said. "He'd always done the accounts himself. But starting, I think it was a year and a half ago, maybe closer to 2 years, he started asking me to do more. Pay the bills, check the balances. He said it was because his eyes were bothering him." She paused. I didn't question it. "Did you notice any transfers? Amounts going out regularly?" She looked at her book. She looked at the lamp. "There were some things I didn't recognize," she said. I asked him once. He said it was investment management fees. She paused again. I didn't know enough to question it. I sat with that. Investment management fees. A clean, reasonable-sounding explanation for a pattern of transfers that would mean nothing to a woman who had never managed the household accounts until her husband's declining health handed them to her. "Mom," I said, "how long did Presley know that Dad was sick?" "Before the hospitalization." My mother looked at me directly. "She visited in August," she said. "And September." She hadn't visited that often in years. She held my eyes. I noticed. I let that sit between us for a moment. The furnace clicked on below us. Outside the window, the fog had come fully down off the ridge and was sitting against the glass, the world on the other side of it reduced to the dark and the shape of the oak tree barely visible at the edge of the yard light. "Did he tell you about the trust?" I asked. "The one with Horowitz." "He mentioned it once," she said. "Years ago. He said he'd gotten things sorted for the property. He didn't say how." She looked at me with the particular expression that meant she was deciding how much of what she already knew she was going to say. "He didn't tell me your name was in it, if that's what you're asking." "But you weren't surprised when I asked about the trust this evening?" "No," she said. "I wasn't." I looked at her. "Mom, did you know about the deed transfer?" "Before today." She was quiet for a moment that had a different quality than her other pauses. Not the pause of consideration, but the pause of a woman deciding whether to tell a truth that is going to land heavily. "Presley mentioned something," she said. "In September. She said your father had decided to make a change to the property arrangement and that she was helping him handle it. She didn't say what the change was." She set her coffee mug on the nightstand. "I asked her directly, the week before your father went into the hospital. I asked her what kind of change. She said it was being taken care of and I shouldn't worry." Something in my chest went very still. "And when the deed transfer came up today," I said. "When Presley handed me the envelope. I saw her take it out of her bag," my mother said quietly. "Before the reception. I didn't say anything because I didn't know what it was. I thought," she stopped. She looked at her hands on the quilt. "I thought she was going to show me something. And then she went to you instead." I didn't fill the silence that followed that. I sat with it and let it mean what it meant. "Get some sleep," I said after a while. She looked at me with the same tired, clear expression she'd been wearing all day. "Dallas," she said. "Be careful about what you can prove and what you only know." "I know," I said. She reached across and put her hand over mine the way Magnolia used to, the same gesture on the same family hands, and the recognition of it settled in my chest with a weight that had nothing performative in it. I turned off her lamp and went back to my room. I lay on the bed in my coat and I looked at the ceiling and I did not try to sleep. I let the facts arrange themselves in the order they wanted to arrange themselves, and I listened to the house settle around me, and I thought about what Anita Reyes had said, a notation in a parcel file creates a record, and what my mother had just told me, and what Kate had said standing at the kitchen window, and what I now understood to be the shape of the 3 months before my father's hospitalization. Presley knew by August. She'd visited twice. She'd mentioned to my mother that a change was being handled. My father had called Cade in September to ask a question about trusts, not Horowitz, not me but Cade, a question that read differently now in light of everything else. And 3 days before his hospitalization, a notary whose address was in Sebastopol had appeared in some room of this house, or somewhere, and a document had been signed. What I didn't know yet was whether my father had understood what he was signing. Whether anyone had explained to him clearly that signing a deed transfer would displace a trust instrument already on file with Horowitz. Whether the notary had been there at my father's request or at someone else's. What I knew was the gap, 17 days between notarization and recording. 6 of those days after my father was hospitalized and on supplemental oxygen. Someone had held that deed for 6 days. And the county recorder's office had called me on a Friday after 4 in the afternoon to tell me that the transfer had not fully cleared review. At some point the furnace went quiet. At some point the fog outside shifted and the yard light came back into partial view, the oak tree resolving itself out of the gray. I lay still and I thought about Horowitz and what he would know and about the trust document that had my name on it, and about the fact that there was a Monday coming and that between now and then I had access to this house and to whatever information it contained. I didn't sleep until close to 3 in the morning. When I did, it was the flat, brief sleep of someone who has set themselves an alarm they know will matter. In the morning my mother came downstairs before I did. I heard her in the kitchen, the particular sequence of sounds that meant coffee, the cabinet, the water running, the grind of the old burr grinder my father had bought 15 years ago and maintained with the same focused attention he gave everything mechanical. When I came down, she was sitting at the kitchen table with both hands around her mug and the light coming in through the east window at a low November angle that made everything look provisional, like the day hadn't fully committed to being a day yet. She looked up when I came in. Her face was tired in the deep-seated way that isn't about one night's sleep. "There's coffee," she said. I poured a cup and sat across from her. The manila envelope was upstairs on the nightstand. The table between us was clean. Dora had done the dishes the night before, stacked everything, left the counters wiped. The fruit tray was gone. Someone had dealt with it. We sat with the coffee for a while. Outside, a Steller's jay landed on the fence post nearest the window and regarded the yard with the proprietary attention of a bird who has decided the yard belongs to it. It sat there for a long moment, electric blue-black against the pale November light, and then it was gone and the yard was just the yard again, the oak tree and the brown November grass and the woodshop with its doors closed. "Presley told you," my mother said finally. Not a question. "She gave me a copy of the deed," I said. My mother nodded. She looked at where the jay had been. "Mom." I kept my voice even. "Did Dad tell you he was doing this?" She was quiet for a moment. The jay did not return. The yard was just the yard. "Your father," she said, and then she stopped. She took a sip of coffee. She set the mug down precisely in the ring it had already made on the table. "Your father had a lot of opinions about what should happen to things. He didn't always share them in advance. Did he tell you he was changing the trust?" "He didn't discuss the trust with me." "Did he tell you he was signing a deed over to Presley?" She looked at me then. Her eyes were tired and clear at the same time, which was a combination I associated with her specifically, with the particular kind of endurance she had developed over 41 years. "He told me the property would be taken care of," she said. "He didn't tell me how." I didn't fill that silence either. The coffee was good, strong, the way it had always been made in this house. Presley came downstairs at 9. Garrett didn't come with her. She was dressed in the careful, neutral way of someone prepared for a continuation: dark slacks, a gray sweater, her hair done. She poured coffee and stood at the counter and looked at me across the kitchen with an expression that had reset overnight into something smoother and more managed than the expression she'd been wearing when I left the kitchen the night before. "I'd like to talk," she said. "All right," I said. My mother excused herself. She did it quietly, taking her coffee and her quilt and going to her chair by the window in the living room, which was both a withdrawal and a statement. I had watched her do that my whole life, remove herself from the field without appearing to retreat. Presley sat down across from me at the kitchen table. "I want you to understand," she said, "that this wasn't done to hurt you." I looked at her. I waited. "Dad came to me," she said. "I didn't go to him. He called me in September and he said he'd been thinking about the property and he'd made a decision and he needed my help to execute it. He said he wanted the deed transferred because he didn't trust that a trust document alone would hold up if it was contested." "Who told him it might be contested?" "He had concerns." "What concerns?" "He felt—" She stopped. She wrapped both hands around her coffee mug in a gesture that looked like something she'd seen someone else do. "He felt that the original trust didn't reflect his actual wishes anymore. He said things between you and him had been strained for a long time and that he wanted to formalize what he actually wanted." "He had a trust in place since 2019, I said. "If his wishes had changed, he had a relationship with an estate attorney. He could have called Horowitz. Horowitz drafted the trust." "Why didn't he call Horowitz?" "He did call Horowitz," Presley said. "In October." "October," I said. "That's 3 weeks before he went into the hospital. After the deed was already signed and notarized. That's not calling Horowitz to change the trust, that's calling Horowitz after something had already been executed." Presley's jaw tightened by a degree. "The notarization was 3 days before he went in." "That's not 3 days, that's a different timeline than you're describing. The notarization is 17 days ago. The filing is 8 days ago. He was admitted 14 days ago. That means someone held that deed for 6 days after he was admitted before filing it." I kept my voice level. "Who held it?" "I held it," Presley said. "I was getting the attorney review completed." 6 days. "Yes. While he was on supplemental oxygen." She looked at the table. She looked at the walnut surface, the table my father had made, the grain he had chosen, the finish his hands had applied. "The timing of the review had nothing to do with his condition," she said. "Attorneys take time. You know that." "Which attorney reviewed it?" I said. She gave me a name, a firm in San Francisco, a name I didn't recognize. "When did you retain them?" I asked. A pause. "Earlier this fall. Before Dad went into the hospital." "Yes." I smoothed my hand flat on the surface of my father's table and I looked at my sister and I thought about September, about my father calling Presley in September, about an attorney retained in the fall before a hospitalization that was theoretically unforeseeable, about a deed held for 6 days after a man was admitted to the hospital on oxygen before someone filed it with the county recorder's office. I thought about what my mother had told me the night before. She visited in August. And September. I noticed. I thought about Kate at the kitchen window. "He told me 14 months ago that the trust was how he wanted the property handled," I said. "In this house. In that woodshop. People change their minds, Dallas." "In 3 days," I said. "Between the day before he was hospitalized and the day he was admitted." "The notarization was 17 days ago," she said. "He signed it before anything happened." "Presley," I said. "I'm going to ask Horowitz for a copy of the original trust instrument. And I'm going to request the full deed filing package from the county recorder's office. I'm telling you this so you know." "I know," she said. Her voice had dropped into the quieter register again. "I expected that. I've already spoken to our attorney and he said everything is in order." "Who is your attorney?" She repeated the San Francisco firm name. "When did you retain them?" I asked again. The same pause. The same answer: earlier this fall. Before the hospitalization. I looked at the table. I thought about the notary stamp, a California notary, a name I didn't recognize, a Sebastopol address. I thought about Garrett on the phone in the driveway at 7:15 in the morning for minutes, his free hand moving in the air the way people gesture when they are explaining something that needs explaining. "Understood," I said, and let it land like a period, not a comma. I recapped the pen that was sitting on the table, my mother's pen, the blue one she used for crosswords, and set it precisely parallel to the edge. Then I stood up. I drove to Santa Rosa that afternoon. Horowitz's office was on the 3rd floor of a 4th Street building, a small suite with a waiting room that smelled like paper and old files. His assistant told me he'd see me shortly. After a few minutes he came out, a compact man in his 60s with reading glasses pushed up on his forehead and the careful, unhurried manner of an attorney who has spent decades delivering information to people in difficult circumstances. He shook my hand. He brought me into his office. He closed the door. "I expected you'd call," he said, settling behind his desk. "You knew about the deed transfer?" "I knew your father had discussions about potentially changing his estate plan. He called me in October." He folded his hands on the desk. "He asked me some questions about the revocable trust and whether a deed transfer would supersede it in California." "What did you tell him?" "I told him the answer depended on the specifics and that I'd want to review any proposed deed transfer before he signed anything. I told him that a transfer done without full capacity documentation could be challenged." He looked at me steadily. "He said he understood and that he'd be in touch." "Was he ever in touch again?" "No," Horowitz said. "He was not." I sat with that for a moment. My father had called Horowitz in October, after the deed had already been notarized in September. He had asked whether a deed transfer would supersede a trust. He had said he understood and that he'd be in touch. And then he had not been in touch, because 11 days later he was in the hospital on supplemental oxygen, and 17 days after that he was dead. "He called you in October," I said. "The deed was notarized in September. He was asking about a transfer that had already been signed." Horowitz looked at me over his reading glasses. He said nothing, which was its own kind of answer. "Did he seem, when you spoke to him in October, did he seem like someone who had made a decision he was comfortable with?" Horowitz was careful. He had spent decades being careful in exactly this way. "He seemed like someone who had a question he needed answered," he said. Whether that question was theoretical or practical, I couldn't tell from one phone call. "The question was whether what he'd already signed could be challenged," I said. Horowitz looked at his hands. He looked at me. "That is one reading of that question," he said. I sat with that. I thought about my father in October, 3 weeks before the hospital, picking up the phone and calling the man who had drawn up the trust, not to revoke it, not to change it, but to ask whether a deed transfer would supersede it. Whether a thing already done could be undone. Whether someone had already rearranged the room and he was trying to figure out what had moved. "I'd like a certified copy of the original trust instrument," I said. "I have it ready," he said. "I had Petra pull it this morning." He reached into the credenza behind his desk, a long lateral file cabinet, dark wood, the kind that holds hanging folders, and he pulled out a manila folder, thicker than I expected, and he set it on the desk and opened it. He took out the top document, multiple pages, stapled, heavy paper, and he set it in front of me on the desk. I looked at the header. Revocable Living Trust of Wade Arthur Collier. Dated March 14, 2019. Prepared by the law offices of M. Horowitz, Santa Rosa, California. I turned to the beneficiary page. My name was there. Dallas Ray Collier, primary beneficiary of the real property located at the Sebastopol address, Sonoma County, California, APN 072-381-004. Specific. Clear. My name in the legal language of an instrument my father had signed 7 years ago, the same compressed cursive at the bottom of the execution page, the same looping W. Horowitz was watching me. "Is there a mechanism," I said, "by which a deed transfer signed 17 days before a man's death, filed 8 days before his death, during a period of hospitalization, by someone other than the grantor, is there a mechanism by which that transfer can be challenged?" "Yes," he said. "Several." "On what grounds?" "Lack of capacity at the time of signing if it can be established. Undue influence. Fraud." He paused. "Also, in California there is a statute, Probate Code Section 21380, that addresses transfers to a person who had a confidential relationship with the transferor. If Presley was involved in the procurement of the transfer, if she arranged the notary, if she was present during the signing, if the transfer was done in a way that suggests she exercised control over the process, that triggers a presumption of undue influence." Was she present during the signing? I asked. Do you know? I don't know, he said. You'd need to find that out. I looked at the trust document under my hands. I thought about the notary stamp, the name I didn't recognize, the Sebastopol address. I thought about Garrett on the phone in the driveway at 7:15 for minutes, his free hand making its explanatory arc in the air. One more question, I said. The notary whose stamp is on the deed transfer. There's a way to verify whether the notary log matches the signing date. Horowitz looked at me over his reading glasses for a moment. Yes, he said. California notaries are required to maintain a journal. The journal is a public record. You can request it. I nodded. I looked at the trust document, my name in the beneficiary line, the date of 2019, my father's signature at the bottom of the execution page. I reached across the desk. I took the document up from the surface. I held it. I'm going to need this copy, I said. That is your copy, Horowitz said. I have the original on file. I folded the document carefully along its original crease lines, the way it had come out of the folder, the way it had been stored, and I slid it into the interior pocket of my coat, against my ribs, where I could feel the weight of it. We shook hands at the door. I took the stairs down instead of the elevator because I needed the 3 floors to let the information settle into something I could carry without it showing on my face. In the parking garage I sat in the rental without starting it. I thought about the notary log, about what it would mean if the journal entry didn't match the date on the deed. I thought about what Horowitz had said, if she arranged the notary, if she was present during the signing, if the transfer was done in a way that suggests she exercised control, and about September and the attorney retained in the fall, and the 6 days someone had held a signed deed while a man lay in a hospital on supplemental oxygen. I took out my phone. I searched for the notary's name, the one from the stamp which I had photographed before putting the deed back in the envelope the night before. The name came up immediately. A Sebastopol address. A California Notary Public Commission number. And a second result, just below the commission listing, a LinkedIn profile, 7 connections, a job listed under current employer. The employer was a property management company. The registered agent of that company, according to the California Secretary of State's website, which I pulled up in a second tab, was listed as Garrett Philip Dade. I set the phone on the passenger seat. I looked through the windshield at the concrete wall of the parking garage. My hands were very still on my thighs. The notary who had witnessed my father's signature on the deed transferring his property to my sister was employed by a company whose registered agent was my sister's husband. I picked up the phone. I did not call anyone. Not yet. I started the car and pulled out slowly, thinking about what Horowitz had said, if she arranged the notary, if she was present during the signing, if the transfer was done in a way that suggests she exercised control over the process, and about September, and the attorney retained before the hospitalization, and 6 days of holding a signed deed while a man lay in a hospital bed. I pulled up the California Secretary of State's business search again at a red light and typed in Garrett Dade's name. 4 LLCs came back. I looked at them on the screen and then I set the phone down and I drove, and when I got to the next red light I looked again. The property management company was registered 18 months ago. But there was an earlier one, Dade Capital Advisors LLC, registered 26 months ago, over 2 years before this day. A different entity, a different registration date, a different stated purpose. But the same registered agent. The same Garrett Philip Dade. 2 companies. Different names. Different registration dates. Both with Garrett's name on the paperwork. I drove back toward Sebastopol through the hills, and the fog was coming in again off the ridge, and my father's trust document was folded against my ribs, and I did not turn on the radio. When I turned onto the road that led to the property, there was a car I didn't recognize parked at the top of the driveway, a dark blue sedan, California plates, facing out. As I slowed to turn in, the driver's door opened and a man got out. He was perhaps 45, in a sport coat and slacks, and he had the particular unhurried quality of someone who is used to waiting and doesn't experience it as inconvenience. He raised a hand. Not a greeting wave. A stop wave. I rolled down my window. Dallas Collier? He said. Yes, I said. He reached into his sport coat and produced a business card, which he held out toward my window. I took it. The card read, Sonoma County District Attorney's Office. Financial Crimes Unit. I've been trying to reach you, he said. I left a message on your Portland number yesterday evening. I'm glad you're still in the area. He paused. Do you have a few minutes? I'd like to talk to you about your father's property transfer. And about some other activity on your father's accounts that our office has been looking at for the past 6 weeks. I looked at the card. The fog was at the top of the ridge. The woodshop doors were closed. The oak tree stood sideways in the wind the way it always had. I looked up at him and did not answer right away. I let the moment sit. My name is Trevino, he said. He had the patience of someone doing this correctly. I'm sorry for your loss. What kind of account activity? I said. I'd rather not do this at the end of a driveway, he said. I looked at the house. The lights were on in the kitchen. Presley's shape moved behind the window. Not the house, I said. There's a diner on the highway before the Gravenstein exit. 20 minutes. 20 minutes, he said. He got back in his car. I slid his card into my coat pocket beside the trust document and backed out of the driveway. Trevino was already in a back booth when I arrived, coffee in front of him, a folder on the table that he hadn't opened yet. He waited while the waitress took my order before he said anything. Your father's accounts, he said, showed a pattern of transfers over the past 18 months that our office began looking at in connection with a separate matter. Small amounts individually, but consistent and consistently to the same destination account. What destination account? I said. A business account registered to a property management LLC. Sebastopol address. He looked at me. The registered agent is a man named Garrett Dade. I kept my hands flat on the table. My voice stayed even. How much total? Over 18 months? Just under $400,000. I looked at him. Small transfers, he said. 1,100 here, 800 there. Nothing that would trigger automatic bank reporting thresholds. But consistent. Every 3 to 4 weeks, starting approximately 22 months ago. My father was alive 22 months ago, I said. He wasn't incapacitated. He was declining, but he was functioning. Yes, Trevino said. Which is part of what makes this complicated. Transfers that originate from a living, functioning adult are harder to characterize as unauthorized. But what our office looks at is the pattern, and the pattern here was consistent enough that we opened a file. He paused. We also looked at the property records. We saw the deed transfer filed 8 days ago. That's what prompted me to reach out directly rather than wait. I thought about September. I thought about my father calling Presley to say he'd made a decision about the property. I thought about an attorney retained in the fall. I thought about $400,000 moving in small increments from my father's accounts to a company that Garrett Dade controlled. I thought about the second LLC I'd found in the Secretary of State's search, Dade Capital Advisors, registered 26 months ago, 2 months before the transfers had apparently started. 2 months of transfers going somewhere before the property management company even existed. The transfers, I said. 22 months ago. What account received them in the first 4 months? Before the property management LLC was registered? Trevino looked at me. Something shifted in his expression, careful, precise, the look of someone recalibrating how much the person across from them already knows. You found the earlier entity, he said. Dade Capital Advisors, I said. Registered 26 months ago. He nodded once. The first 4 months of transfers went to an account associated with that entity, yes. We identified it 2 weeks ago. He opened the folder. Inside were printed bank statements, copies, not originals, the kind made from digital records. He turned them so I could read them. The authorization signatures on the transfer forms are your father's. Or they appear to be. Handwriting analysis is still pending. He pointed to a column of figures. But what I draw your attention to is the dates. I looked at the dates. I looked at the column. The transfers had started, the first one, $1,140, 22 months ago, a Wednesday in January. They ran forward in steady intervals from there, through that winter, through spring and summer, into the fall of last year and this year. The last one was 31 days ago. My father had been in the hospital for 14 days. The last transfer had occurred 17 days before this moment, 3 days before the hospitalization, 2 days before the date on the notary stamp on the deed. My father had been alive and at home and apparently functional enough to authorize a bank transfer 3 days before he was hospitalized. And someone had used those same 3 days to get his signature on a deed. I didn't say any of this out loud. I looked at the bank statement page and I let what I was seeing land in the correct order. Ms. Collier, Trevino said. I want to be clear about what my office can and can't do at this stage. We're in a preliminary phase. We're not at the point of any formal action. What I'm here to do is make contact with family members who might have relevant information or documentation, trust instruments, correspondence, anything that speaks to your father's intentions and his capacity in the period leading up to these transfers and the deed signing. I have the original trust instrument, I said. From 2019. Naming me as the primary beneficiary of the Sebastopol property. Something in Trevino's expression, not surprise exactly, but a kind of careful attention coming into focus. Do you have it with you? I reached into my coat. I drew out the folded trust document from Horowitz's office. I set it on the table between us, unfolded it, smoothed it flat, the way you smooth a page you want someone else to read clearly. He looked at it for a long moment. He looked at my name in the beneficiary line. He looked at the date. I'd like to make a copy of this, he said. With your permission. You can have that copy, I said. Horowitz has the original on file. Trevino took the document. He folded it carefully and set it inside his folder. He looked at me across the table with the particular expression of someone who has just received something he was hoping to receive and is being professionally careful about what that means. I also found something else, I said. He waited. The notary on the deed transfer, I said. The name on the stamp. She's employed by a property management company. The registered agent of that company is Garrett Dade. The diner was warm and smelled like coffee and something frying. The pie case rotated slowly in the background. Trevino looked at me for a moment without speaking. When did you find that? He said. An hour ago, I said. In the parking garage in Santa Rosa. He nodded slowly. He wrote something in his small, narrow notebook without looking up. Then he clicked the pen closed. Ms. Collier, he said. I'm going to give you my direct number. If anything else surfaces, any documents, any communications, anything from your father that relates to the property or his accounts, I need you to call me before you discuss it with your sister or her husband. All right, I said. One more thing, he said. He reopened the folder. He removed one more page, a single sheet, and placed it on the table facing me. This is a transfer record from approximately 16 months ago. Can you tell me whether you recognize this account number in the recipient field? I looked at the page. The recipient account number was a 10-digit string. Below it, in the bank's field for account name, was a partial. The system had truncated it, the way some records do, and what remained was Collier D. I looked at it for a long time. Collier D. My initial. My surname. An account I had never opened, receiving a transfer from my father's account 16 months ago. I looked up at Trevino. His expression had not changed. I don't recognize that account number, I said. My voice was steady. That is not an account I have. I didn't think so, he said quietly. The pie case completed another rotation. Through the diner window, the fog was fully in now, the highway reduced to 2 red taillights disappearing into gray. Someone had opened an account in my name. Someone had moved money into it. And when my father's estate was eventually scrutinized, that account was going to appear in the record, a transfer to a Collier D. account, suggesting that both daughters had benefited from the movement of funds. I sat in the booth with my hands flat on the laminate table and I looked at the page and I let myself understand what I was looking at. The full architecture of it. Not a deed transfer executed in panic, not a rushed decision in the final weeks. This had been running for nearly 2 years. The 2 LLCs. The incremental transfers. The account in my name positioned as a hedge, a way to muddy the record if anyone looked too closely. The notary who worked for Garrett's company. The attorney retained months before the hospitalization. The deed held for 6 days while my father lay in the hospital. This had been planned. Not improvised in grief. Planned. Understood, I said to no one in particular, just to the table, to the page, to the space in front of me. And then I didn't say anything else for a long moment. I let the silence hold what it needed to hold. Before we left the diner, Trevino said, Ms. Collier. Whoever built this was careful. The account in your name is one piece of it. There may be others. I drove back to the house in the dark. The fog had come all the way down off the ridge, sitting on the road in layers the headlights cut through without illuminating. You could see the light leaving the car but not what it landed on. The kind of driving that requires you to trust the road is there rather than see it. I kept both hands on the wheel and I thought about the Collier account and my father's signature on bank transfer forms that might or might not have been his. I pulled into the driveway and sat in the car for a moment with the engine off. The kitchen lights were still on. Through the window I could see the back of Garrett's head. He was at the kitchen table, facing away from me, facing toward where Presley would be sitting across from him. They didn't appear to be talking. They appeared to be waiting. I got out of the car. I went in through the back door. They both looked up when I came in. "Where did you go?" Presley asked. "Santa Rosa," I said. "Horowitz." Something moved across Garrett's face. "Quick." He picked up his phone from the table and looked at the screen without appearing to see it. "And?" Presley said. "And I have a copy of the trust document," I said. "I'll be making some calls Monday." I poured a glass of water at the sink. I drank it standing there. The kitchen was very quiet except for the furnace and the window and the sound of Garrett setting his phone back on the table. "Dallas," Presley said. Her voice had shifted into something softer at the edges, the way voices get when they are preparing to ask for something rather than defend against something. "I want you to think about what you're doing. We're burying Dad. It's been 2 days. You're about to spend what months? Years? In a legal process that will cost you money you don't have and won't change what Dad actually wanted." "You don't know what Dad actually wanted," I said. "You know what you needed him to want." Presley's jaw tightened. Garrett was very still. "That's not fair," she said. "The deed was filed 8 days ago," I said. 17 days after the notarization. 6 days into his hospitalization. The notary is employed by a company Garrett controls. I set the glass down on the counter. "Tell me which part of that is fair." Garrett stood up from the table. "Dallas," he said. His voice was level and measured, the voice of a man who has decided the women in the room need a moderating presence. "Nobody is trying to hurt you. This is a hard day for everyone. What Presley is asking is for you to step back and let the grief settle before you make decisions that can't be unmade." I looked at him. "Garrett," I said, "why is the notary on my father's deed transfer employed by your property management company?" The kitchen was very quiet. "She's a contractor," Garrett said. "She does notary work for various clients. The fact that she's done work for one of my LLCs has nothing to do with this. She's listed as a current employee on LinkedIn," I said. "Not a contractor." "LinkedIn isn't a legal document," he said. "No," I said. "But the notary journal is. And it's a public record. And I've requested it." That was not entirely true. I had asked Horowitz how to request it, but not yet submitted the request. I said it the way I said it because I wanted to see what happened to Garrett's face. What happened was nothing. His expression didn't change. Which was its own kind of information. "I think," Presley said, "that you should sleep on this." I looked at my sister. I looked at the table between us, my father's table, walnut, the surface his hands had made. I thought about March 14, 2019, on the header of the trust document folded inside my coat. "I'm going to check on Mom," I said. I found my mother in her bedroom, not asleep. She was sitting up in bed with the lamp on and a book open in her lap that she wasn't reading. She looked up when I knocked on the doorframe. "Come in," she said. I came in and sat in the chair beside the bed, the old wingback, the one that had been in that room my whole life, the fabric worn on both armrests from decades of use. I sat in it and looked at my mother and she looked at me and neither of us said anything for a moment. "I need to ask you something," I said. "All right." "In the months before Dad went into the hospital, you mentioned last night that he'd been asking you to handle more of the accounts. The transfers you saw, the ones he said were investment management fees, did he ever say specifically who was managing the investment? Did he say Garrett's name?" My mother considered this with the focused attention she gave to questions she understood the weight of. "He said it was someone Presley had connected him with," she said. "Someone who understood this kind of arrangement. He didn't say who." She paused. "I assumed it was someone reputable. Presley has always presented Garrett as someone who knows how things work." I nodded. "One more thing. The transfers, do you still have access to the account statements? Online banking, anything like that?" She looked at me with the same tired, clear expression. "I have the login," she said. He gave it to me about 2 years ago when he asked me to start handling more of the bills. She paused. I haven't looked at it since he went into the hospital. I didn't know what I was looking for. I think you might know now, I said. She was quiet for a moment. Then, I'll look in the morning. I said goodnight. I went back to my room and lay on the bed and did not sleep for a long time, turning the shape of what I knew over in my mind the way you turn an unfamiliar object in your hands looking for the seam. The next morning I was in the kitchen at 6:30 before anyone else was down. I made coffee. I sat at my father's table with my phone and Trevino's card and the photographs I'd taken of the deed transfer, and I organized what I knew into a sequence that held together. What I knew: the trust, March 2019, my name. The transfers, 22 months of them, first to Dade Capital Advisors and then to the Property Management LLC, both controlled by Garrett. The deed, notarized 17 days ago, filed 8 days ago. The notary, Garrett's employee. The Collier D account, opened in my name without my knowledge, receiving at least one transfer 16 months ago. What I didn't know: whether my father had signed the deed willingly, under pressure, or without full understanding. Whether Presley had been present at the signing. Whether the notary's journal matched the date. Whether there were other accounts. What I needed: the notary journal. My father's account records going back further. The Property Management LLC's full registration history. And something I'd been circling since the parking garage in Santa Rosa, the WC Holdings LLC I'd noticed in Garrett's Secretary of State results. 4 LLCs total. The Property Management Company, Dade Capital Advisors, one whose purpose I hadn't read carefully, and a 4th, WC Holdings. The initials: Wade Collier. I pulled up the California Secretary of State's business search on my phone. I typed in WC Holdings. The result came back: registered 4 years ago. Registered agent, Garrett Philip Dade. Managing member, Garrett Philip Dade. Silent partner listed in the filing summary, Wade A. Collier. I set the phone face down on the table. I turned it back over. I read the summary again. 4 years ago, my father had been listed as a silent partner in a company whose managing member was his son-in-law. 4 years ago, the same year, Horowitz had drawn up the revocable living trust naming me as the primary beneficiary of the Sebastopol property. The same year. I was still looking at the screen when I heard footsteps on the stairs. Presley came into the kitchen. She was dressed again. She always dressed before coming downstairs, even here, even now, and she looked at me at the table with my phone, and her expression went through a brief, controlled recalibration before she went to the coffee. "You're up early," she said. "I didn't sleep much," I said. She poured coffee. She stood at the counter. She looked out the window at the yard, which in the early light was silver gray, the frost on the grass not quite gone yet, the oak tree standing in its sideways angle against the pale sky. "I need to talk to you," she said. "Not the way we talked yesterday. I need to actually talk to you." I set my phone face down on the table. "All right," I said. She sat down across from me. She held her coffee in both hands. She looked at me with the expression of someone who has spent the night deciding how much to say and has arrived at a number. "There are things about Dad's last 2 years that you don't know," she said. "Because you weren't here." "Tell me," I said. "He was scared," she said. "Not physically, he wasn't afraid of dying, or not the way you'd expect. He was scared of what would happen to the money. To the property. He'd made some decisions over the years that he hadn't told anyone about. Investments that hadn't worked out. Some debt he'd been carrying that Mom didn't know about. He came to me in August because he needed help sorting it out." I looked at her. "What kind of debt?" "Enough that the property would have been at risk if it had come out in probate without the transfer completed first." She kept her eyes steady on mine. "He asked me to help him protect it. The transfer was his idea, Dallas. All of it. He wanted the property in my name because he trusted Garrett to manage it correctly, and because he knew, he told me directly, that if it went through the trust and into probate, the creditors would come after it." I sat with this. I let it sit between us and I looked at it from several angles. "How much debt?" I said. "Significant," she said. "Over $1 million. "And the transfers to Garrett's LLC," I said. "Over $400,000 over 18 months. Were those debt payments?" Presley's hands tightened on the mug. "Who told you about those transfers?" "It doesn't matter," I said. "Were they debt payments?" "They were management fees," she said. Garrett was managing the situation. He has expertise in this. It cost money. Management fees, I said. For managing the concealment of your father's debt from your mother and his other daughter, paid to an LLC your husband formed 2 months after the payments started. That's not, she started. And the account in my name, I said. The Collier account that received a transfer from Dad's account 16 months ago. Was that a management fee too? Presley went very still. The stillness was different from her practiced steadiness. This was the stillness of someone who has not accounted for a specific variable and is very rapidly doing the math on it. I don't know what you're talking about, she said. I think you do, I said. Dallas. Her voice dropped, not theatrical, controlled, deliberate, the tone of someone who has decided to stop explaining and start warning. I am trying to help you understand something before this gets worse. You are about to take a situation that is complicated and make it into a war. And you will lose that war. You don't have the money for it, you don't have the documentation, and you don't have. I have the trust document, I said. I have the notary connection to Garrett's LLC. I have the transfer records. I have a contact at the Sonoma County DA's Financial Crimes Unit who has had a file open on those transfers for 6 weeks. I kept my voice even and flat. And I have a recording of this conversation. I did not have a recording. My phone was face down on the table. But I watched her face when I said it. What happened to Presley's face was not dramatic. It was the opposite of dramatic. It was a quieting, a series of small adjustments, rapid and involuntary, the way a room looks when all the furniture has been moved 3 inches in every direction. Everything still in its approximate place but nothing quite where it was. You're lying, she said. Maybe, I said. Do you want to find out? Garrett appeared in the kitchen doorway. He had come downstairs without either of us hearing him. He moved quietly for a large man, and he was standing there in his clothes from the night before, which meant he hadn't slept either, which meant he had been awake in the dark doing his own version of the math I had been doing. He looked at the table. He looked at Presley. He looked at me. This needs to stop, he said. His voice was flat and final in a way that his voice the previous night had not been. Dallas, you need to go back to Portland. You need to let this go. This isn't your fight and it isn't your house, and the sooner you understand that the better for everyone, including your mother. Why would going back to Portland be better for my mother? I asked. Because dragging this into court will destroy what's left of this family, he said. Because your father made his decision and you don't get to override it because you don't like it. My father made a trust in 2019, I said. That is his documented decision. Your father changed his mind, Garrett said. People are allowed to change their minds. That's the whole point of a revocable trust. Then why didn't he revoke it through Horowitz? I asked. Why didn't he call his estate attorney, the man who drafted the trust, and say, I've changed my mind, please revoke this and draw up new documents? Why did he instead sign a deed transfer with a notary employed by your company and have his daughter hold that deed for 6 days after he was hospitalized before filing it? Garrett looked at me. His jaw was set. Behind him in the hallway I could hear my mother's footsteps beginning on the stairs, the slow, deliberate placement of someone who knows exactly where the boards creak and steps around them out of 41 years of habit. Because he didn't trust you, Garrett said. His voice was very quiet and very clear. He said it to Presley in August and I was in the room when he said it. He said, Dallas has never been here when it mattered. She left and she stayed gone and she doesn't get to come back and collect what she didn't earn. The kitchen was very quiet. My mother's footsteps reached the bottom of the stairs. The kitchen door opened. She left and she stayed gone and she doesn't get to come back and collect what she didn't earn, Garrett said again, the same words, slightly slower, as though he wanted to make sure each one arrived. That is what your father said. Those are his words. You want to go to court and argue with a dead man's words, Dallas, you go ahead. I looked at him. I looked at the table. I looked at the grain of the walnut and the worn smooth place in the center where 40 years of hands had passed across it, and I thought about how those words, delivered with the certainty of a man who believes he has won the room, were going to land in front of a judge alongside a transfer log showing $400,000 flowing out of my father's accounts, a notary employed by the man who had spoken them, and an account in my name I had never opened. My mother stood in the kitchen doorway in her robe, holding her coffee, looking at the 3 of us with the tired, clear expression she'd worn for 2 days. Garrett's eyes were on me. His voice, when he said it the third time, was almost gentle, the gentleness of someone who believes they have already won. She left and she stayed gone, and she doesn't get to come back and collect what she didn't earn. And my mother was standing in the doorway, and the frost was still on the grass outside the window, and I had not moved, and I had not answered, and the kitchen was holding the shape of what had just been said, the way a room holds sound after the sound stops. Not echo, just presence, the air not yet returned to what it was before. "Colleen," Garrett said, turning to my mother. His voice shifted, warmer, the register he used when he was managing rather than confronting. "Why don't you let me get you some breakfast? Dallas and Presley were just finishing up." My mother looked at Garrett. Then she looked at me. Her eyes were tired and clear, the same as yesterday morning. She moved across the kitchen to the table, and she sat down in the chair beside mine, not across from me, beside me, and she set her coffee down on the table, and she folded her hands around it, and she looked at Garrett. "I'll have breakfast in a few minutes," she said. "Sit down, Garrett." Garrett looked at her. He looked at Presley. Presley was looking at the table. He sat. My mother looked at him for a moment without saying anything. The kitchen held the silence. "Garrett," she said, "my husband is 3 days in the ground. I have heard some of what you just said to my daughter. And I want you to tell me directly while I am sitting here about the investment management fees." Garrett's expression did not move. "Colleen, this isn't the right time." "It is exactly the right time," my mother said. Her voice was quiet and very even. "Dallas is here. Presley is here. Tell me about the fees you charged my husband to manage the debt he had that I didn't know about." The kitchen was very quiet. Presley said, "Mom." "Presley," my mother said without looking at her. "Not right now." Garrett put both hands flat on the table. He looked at them. He looked at my mother. "Wade came to us," he said. "He asked for help. I provided it. The fees were agreed upon." "In writing?" my mother asked. A pause. "We had an understanding." "An understanding," my mother said. "My husband had an understanding with you in private about fees drawn from our accounts without telling me. He wanted to protect you from the stress of it," Garrett said. My mother picked up her coffee. She took one sip. She set it back down in its ring. "And the property," she said. "The deed. He signed that to protect me from the stress of it too." "He signed it to protect the asset," Garrett said. "The debt would have." "How much debt?" my mother said. Garrett looked at Presley. "Don't look at her," my mother said. "I'm asking you." The frost outside was melting now in the early sun. I could see it going, the silver leaving the grass in patches. The oak tree. The closed woodshop doors. Inside this kitchen, 3 days after my father's burial, the morning light was doing what it always did, coming through the east window at its low November angle, laying a rectangle of pale gold across the walnut table, making everything look provisional and then, in the next moment, simply real. "We're still working through the full picture," Garrett said. "It's complex." "The DA's office," my mother said, "isn't working through it. They've had 6 weeks. They appear to have a clear picture already." She looked at him. "Why would they have a clearer picture than you do?" Garrett went still. Real still, not the performed stillness of the previous 2 days, but the stillness of someone recalculating in real time. He looked at my mother, and then he looked at me, and then he looked back at my mother, and he said, in the quiet voice of a man deciding how much to admit, "What do you know about the DA's office?" "Enough," my mother said. That was not entirely true. She hadn't known about Trevino until this moment, had absorbed the reference with the focused calm of a woman who had spent 41 years learning to gather information without revealing she was gathering it. Garrett looked at Presley again. Presley, this time, did not look back at him. "Presley," he said. The warmth was gone from his voice now. What was underneath it was flat and pressured and specific. "Presley, we need to." "Not here," Presley said. She was looking at the table. "Not right now." "Presley." I said, "Not right now, Garrett." Her voice cracked on the last word, not from emotion but from strain, the crack of something held in one position too long. She looked up then, not at Garrett, not at me, at my mother. "Mom," she said. "I'm sorry." My mother looked at her daughter. Her face did not change, no softening, no hardening, just the same tired clarity. "What for?" she said. Presley opened her mouth. Closed it. The question, delivered without inflection, without the softness that would have made it easier to answer, sat between them. Garrett stood up from the table. He picked up his phone. He walked out of the kitchen and I heard him in the hallway, then the sound of him going upstairs and then nothing. The three of us sat in the kitchen. The frost was almost gone from the grass. The burr grinder was still on the counter. The blue crossword pen was still parallel to the table edge where I had set it the morning before. My mother looked at me. She looked at the coat I had been wearing for 2 days, with the trust document folded inside it. She looked at the table and the chairs and the particular quality of the morning light on the walnut surface. "Tell me," she said, "what you know." I told her about the recorder's call, Horowitz and the trust, the notary's connection to Garrett's LLC, the Collier D account, Trevino and the bank statements, $400,000 moving in steady increments. I told her about Dade Capital Advisors, registered 26 months ago, and WC Holdings, registered 4 years ago with my father listed as a silent partner. I told her about the operating agreement I hadn't yet seen but which the Secretary of State summary suggested existed, an instrument that, if structured the way Garrett structured things, would have given him control of the property regardless of what the trust said. My mother listened without interrupting. She asked 2 questions, the amount of the first transfer and the name of Trevino's unit. I told her both. When I finished she was quiet for a moment. "Your grandmother knew," she said. I looked at her. "Not about Garrett. She died before any of this started. But she knew your father had a way of managing things that left other people in the dark. She told me once, the year before she died, that she hoped the land would go where it was supposed to go." She looked at me. "I think she meant you." I thought about the kitchen table. The double wedding ring quilt on the chair arm. The 2 cups of coffee Magnolia had poured without asking. That was always going to be you. My mother reached across the table and put her hand over mine. The way Magnolia had. The same table. The same gesture. The same morning light coming through the east window in November, at the low angle that made everything look provisional, and I looked at our hands on the walnut surface and I thought, not provisional. Not anymore. Upstairs I heard Garrett's voice, low, rapid, urgent, and then a door closing. My mother didn't move her hand. And then from upstairs, clear enough to carry through the ceiling and into the kitchen below, Presley's voice. "What do you mean it's already too late?" My mother's hand was still over mine when Presley came downstairs. She came down alone. Garrett's voice had gone quiet above us a few minutes after that single line, and then there had been nothing, and then footsteps on the stairs, and then Presley in the kitchen doorway in the same gray sweater, her hair still done, but something in her face that had not been there yesterday or the day before. Not grief exactly. Something that lived on the other side of grief, the thing you get to when the position you've held for months stops being tenable and you have to decide very quickly what you actually are. She looked at my mother's hand over mine on the table. She sat down. Not across from us, she pulled out the chair at the end of the table, the one nobody ever sat in, the one nearest the window, and she sat in it sideways, not fully at the table, as though she hadn't fully decided to be in the conversation yet. "He called his attorney," she said. "Garrett. He's been on the phone with them since 5 this morning." My mother looked at her. "What did they tell him?" "That the DA opening a formal inquiry changes things." Presley looked at the table. "That the account in Dallas's name, if it exists the way they're saying it exists, is something that's going to be very hard to explain." She paused. "He didn't tell me about the account. He told me it was a holding account for the fees. He said it was administrative." I looked at my sister. I let the silence hold for a moment before I said anything. "Did you know about the other LLC?" I asked. "WC Holdings. The one with Dad listed as a silent partner." Presley looked up at me. "What other LLC?" "WC Holdings was registered 4 years ago," I said. "Garrett is listed as managing member. Dad is listed as silent partner. The initials are your father's initials." I kept my voice even. "If there's an operating agreement, and there will be, Garrett structures things in writing, it likely names Garrett as the person who takes full control of all contributed assets on the silent partner's death." Presley's face went through something complicated and rapid. "Contributed assets," she said slowly. "The property," I said. "If Dad was induced to contribute the Sebastopol property as capital to that LLC 4 years ago, Garrett would own it outright the moment Dad died. Not through the deed transfer, through the operating agreement. The deed was a backup layer. The kitchen was very quiet. The furnace. The window frame. The frost almost fully gone from the grass outside. He built 2 of them, I said. Presley looked at her hands. She looked at the table. She looked at the walnut surface and what was sitting on top of it, the blue crossword pen still parallel to the edge, the coffee mugs, the ordinary objects of a morning in a family kitchen, and she looked at all of it the way you look at a room when you realize the room you thought you were in is not the room you are actually in. He told me the deed was the instrument, she said. He told me the trust was old and superseded and the deed was the correct document. He never mentioned an LLC. She looked up at me. He needed my name on the deed. He needed a family member's name on it. He needed it to look like a family decision, I said. And he needed you to believe it was one. She was quiet for a long time. When Dad called me in August, she said, and said he needed my help, I thought he was choosing me. I thought he was saying that I was the one who'd stayed. That you'd left and I'd stayed and he was acknowledging that. I wanted it to be that. Her jaw tightened, not with anger but with the effort of saying a true thing plainly. I wanted to be the one he trusted. I sat with that. I thought about my father's management, the years of small separations, the slightly false picture each of us had been given of the other. And I thought about how useful that distance had been to someone who needed us not to compare notes. He used what Dad had already built between us, I said. The distance. I know, Presley said. I've been sitting with that since last night. She looked at my mother. I was in the house when the notary came, she said. Garrett arranged it. He said Dad had requested it, that he'd been asking for weeks, that he wanted the deed done before anything happened. He said I should be there but stay upstairs, that it would be less complicated. She paused. Garrett was in the room with Dad and the notary. I heard them downstairs. I heard my father's voice. He sounded like himself. I thought he knew what he was signing. She stopped. She looked at her hands. I think now that knowing what you're signing and understanding what it does are 2 different things. And I think Garrett knew that too. My mother looked at her daughter. Her face held the same tired, clear quality it had held for 3 days, but something in it had shifted, not softened but settled, the way ground settles after a long rain. I'm going to get my own attorney, Presley said. Good, I said. I'll call Trevino, she said. And I'll tell him what I just told you. About the notary, about being upstairs. She paused. It won't undo what I participated in. No, I said. But it will build the record. She nodded. She stood up, straightened the chair she'd been sitting in, and went to the counter to pour more coffee. She stood at the counter holding the mug and looking out the window at the yard, the frost gone now, the oak tree and the brown November grass in the thin morning sun. Trevino called, I said. This morning. He wants me to come in. Trevino called at 9:15. I was in the room at the end of the hall when the phone rang. I answered on the second ring. Ms. Collier, he said. I'm going to need you to come in this morning if you're still in the area. We've had some developments. What kind of developments? I said. The handwriting analysis came back preliminary this morning. The authorization signatures on the transfer forms, 4 of the 18-month series, show characteristics inconsistent with a voluntary signature. Possible guided hand indicators. He paused. That changes the classification of what we're looking at. I sat down on the edge of the bed. The same bed I'd sat on Friday night. The same hook on the back of the door. Guided hand, I said. It means someone may have physically assisted in producing the signature, he said. It's preliminary, a full expert analysis takes longer. But it was enough for us to move on the warrant this morning. What warrant? For the financial records of 3 of Garrett Dade's LLCs, he said. Including the property management company, Dade Capital Advisors, and a third entity called WC Holdings, which we identified overnight. I can't go into detail on the phone, but I wanted you to know that the timeline is moving faster than I indicated yesterday, and I'd like to have the notary journal request formalized through our office rather than through a private request, which will make it faster. I told him I would come. I told my mother where I was going. She nodded and said she would call Dora, who had offered to come back today, and I said that was a good idea. I went downstairs with my coat and my keys. Garrett was in the kitchen, standing at the counter, not sitting. He had changed his clothes. He looked at me when I came in and something moved across his face, not warmth, not the performed management of the previous days, just a flat, careful attention. "Where are you going?" he said. "Out," I said. I went out through the back door. The DA's office was in a building on Administration Drive in Santa Rosa, a complex of county offices that smelled like carpet cleaner and recycled air. Trevino met me in the lobby and brought me upstairs to a conference room with a long table and windows that faced a parking structure. He was not alone. A woman named Chen, introduced as a senior investigator from the Financial Crimes Unit, was already seated at the table with a laptop and 3 folders. I sat down across from them. I put my coat over the back of the chair. The trust document was still in the interior pocket. I had been carrying it for 2 days. "I appreciate you coming in," Trevino said. He opened the first folder. "I want to walk you through what we have and what we're going to need from you today." "All right," I said. The warrant this morning covered 3 entities: Dade Property Management LLC, Dade Capital Advisors LLC, that's the earlier one, the one predating the Property Management Company, and WC Holdings, registered 4 years ago. The WC designation. "Wade Collier," I said. "That's our REIT as well," Trevino said. WC Holdings was registered 4 years ago with Garrett Dade listed as the managing member and your father listed as a silent partner. The operating agreement, which we obtained through the warrant, names your father as contributing capital in exchange for a 30% interest. The capital contribution, per the agreement, was the Sebastopol property, valued at the time at just over $1 million. I looked at him. "Your father signed an operating agreement 4 years ago," Trevino said, "that contributed the Sebastopol property as capital to an LLC in which Garrett Dade held 70% controlling interest." I looked at the table. I thought about 4 years ago. My father had been 59. The property had not yet been assessed at its current value. And 4 years ago my father had been what? Worried about money? Already in debt? Or simply in the way he had always operated, managing things privately, trusting the wrong person, believing he was making a smart arrangement when he was being walked into a corner? "He didn't know what he was signing," I said. "We don't know that yet," Chin said. "What we know is that the operating agreement was prepared by an attorney who is not Horowitz, a different firm, a San Francisco address, and that your father's signature appears on it without any indication that he had independent legal review." "The trust was drawn up the same year," I said. "March 2019. That's 4 years ago. He was setting up a trust with Horowitz at the same time he was signing an operating agreement with Garrett's LLC. Trevino and Chin looked at each other briefly. "That's a significant detail," Trevino said. "We hadn't connected those dates yet." I reached into my coat. I drew out the trust document, the folded pages, the March 14, 2019 header, the Horowitz letterhead, and I set it on the table and unfolded it slowly, smoothing each crease as it opened, and I laid it flat between us. "March 14, 2019, I said. "The same quarter. Possibly the same month." Chen pulled the trust document toward her. She looked at the header. She looked at the execution date. She turned to the beneficiary page. "I'll need to make a copy of this for the file," she said. "It's yours," I said. "Horowitz has the original." She took the document and left the room. Trevino looked at me across the table. "Ms. Collier," he said, "I want to be direct with you about where this is going. The operating agreement, the transfer series, the deed filing, and now the timing of the trust, taken together, this is not a family dispute about inheritance. This is a pattern. A documented pattern of financial exploitation of an elderly person with declining capacity." He paused. "Your father's medical records from the 3 years before his death, have you requested those?" "Not yet," I said. "We'll be requesting them through the warrant. But if you have standing to request them independently, as an interested heir, it would be worth doing in parallel." I nodded. "I'll call Horowitz." "Good." He opened the second folder. "There's one more thing I want to show you." He turned several pages of the WC Holdings operating agreement and set it in front of me, his finger indicating a paragraph near the bottom of page 4. I leaned forward. I read the paragraph. The paragraph described the disposition of the Sebastopol property in the event of the silent partner's death. In that event, the silent partner's interest, 30% of the LLC, would pass not to his estate and not to any trust instrument, but to the managing member, consolidating full ownership of the LLC and all its contributed assets in Garrett Dade. In the event of Wade Collier's death, Garrett Dade would own 100% of an LLC whose primary contributed asset was the Sebastopol property. The deed transfer to Presley had been an additional layer. Not the mechanism, the backup. The operating agreement was the mechanism. The deed was insurance. I sat back in my chair. He built 2 of them, I said. It appears so, Trevino said. And the account in my name, I said. The Collier D account. Was that a management fee too? Chen had returned to the room with the trust document and a copy receipt. She set the original in front of me and sat down. The Collier D account, she said, appears to have been opened using your social security number and a Sebastopol mailing address. We're still verifying. But the single transfer that hit that account 16 months ago was for $6,200. Not a round number. A specific amount, I said. Specific enough to look like a real transaction rather than a placeholder, Chin said. If your father's estate ever became subject to scrutiny, that transfer would appear in his records as a disbursement to you. It would suggest you'd been receiving money too. I looked at the table. The conference room window faced the parking structure, gray concrete in the November light, and beyond it a slice of the Santa Rosa skyline and a strip of sky the color of old pewter. How do I challenge both instruments? I said. The deed and the operating agreement. That's a question for your attorney, Trevino said. But the answer exists. The operating agreement has its own vulnerability. Your father signed it without independent legal counsel, apparently in the same period he was working with Horowitz on the trust, which raises questions about whether he understood the implications of both documents simultaneously. NWC Holdings is now subject to our warrant, which means its records are part of a criminal investigation, which complicates Garrett Dade's ability to act on it unilaterally. What happens now? I said. We continue building the record, Trevino said. The notary journal request goes out today through our office. The medical records request is in process. The handwriting expert does the full analysis on the transfer signatures within 2 weeks. He paused. And Garrett Dade's attorney called our office this morning at 8:45. What did they want? I said. They wanted to know the scope of the warrant, Trevino said. Standard attorney response. But the timing, before 9 in the morning the day after I made contact with you, suggests that Mr. Dade was aware of our investigation before yesterday. I thought about Presley's voice through the ceiling. What do you mean it's already too late? He had known before Presley told him about Trevino. He had known before I mentioned it at the kitchen table. He had known because 6 weeks ago, when Trevino's office had begun looking at the transfers, someone had told him. Is there someone inside your office who might have contacted him? I said. Trevino's expression didn't change. That's something we take seriously, he said. I can't discuss it further. I nodded. I stood up. I picked up my coat from the chair back. Ms. Collier, Trevino said. He stood as well. The operating agreement. The fact that it exists, the fact that it was drawn up the same year as the trust, the fact that your father had 2 parallel estate instruments both signed in the same quarter, that is significant. It raises the question of whether your father understood, when he signed the trust with Horowitz, that he had already signed an agreement that would override it. He didn't know, I said. You believe that? He told me the property was squared away, I said. In the woodshop. 14 months ago. He wouldn't have said it that way if he'd known the LLC agreement would take the property from the trust. I looked at Trevino. He thought Horowitz's trust was the operative document. Garrett let him think that. Trevino looked at me for a moment. That, he said carefully, is a version of events that the evidence is consistent with. I drove back to the house. The fog was gone by midday, burned off entirely, and the hills were the particular bright gold of Sonoma County in late fall, the dry grass catching the noon light in a way that made the landscape look like something painted rather than real. The oak tree on the property was visible from the road as I turned in, sideways as always as it had always been. My grandfather had planted it. My father had grown up in its shadow. I had climbed it when I was 8 and cut my palm on the bark, and my grandmother Magnolia had wrapped it in a dish towel and said, "The land keeps you honest." I went in through the back door. Garrett was in the hallway with his phone to his ear and his coat on. The coat on was new, it meant he was going somewhere or had just come back from somewhere. He looked at me when I came in and said into the phone, "I'll call you back," and he ended the call. We stood in the hallway. The wallpaper in the hallway was the same wallpaper that had been there since my grandfather's time. A narrow stripe, cream and pale green, worn smooth near the light switch from 40 years of hands. "Dallas," he said. "Garrett," I said. "Whatever they told you this morning," he said, "I want you to understand something. Your father came to me. I didn't come to him. He was in debt and he was scared and he needed someone who knew how to handle the kind of problem he had, and I helped him. Everything I did because he asked me to." I looked at him. I kept my voice even and flat. "He asked you to open an LLC in his name without telling his estate attorney," I said. "He asked you to contribute his property to that LLC as capital without independent legal review. He asked you to run $400,000 through that LLC in management fees over 18 months. He asked you to arrange a notary, your own employee, to witness his signature on a deed transfer 3 days before his hospitalization. He asked you to file that deed 6 days after he was admitted to a hospital on supplemental oxygen." I paused. "And he asked you to open an account in my name and put money in it." Garrett's jaw was set. His eyes were very steady. He said, "Your father told Presley, and I was in the room, that you had never been there when it mattered. That you left and you stayed gone and you don't get to come back and collect what you didn't earn." He said that. He stepped closer by 1 step, not threatening, precise. "Whatever you think you found, whatever story you're building with the DA, those are his words. That is what he wanted." I looked at him. I didn't move. My voice stayed level and quiet. "The operating agreement," I said. "WC Holdings. The one that gives you full control of the Sebastopol property when my father dies, regardless of the trust, regardless of the deed." Was that what he wanted to? Something moved across Garrett's face. The first uncontrolled thing I had seen there in 3 days, a shift, rapid and involuntary, there and gone before he could catch it. "I don't know what you think." "The DA has the warrant," I said. "The records are already pulled. The operating agreement is in the file. They know it was signed in March 2019, the same month the trust was drawn up with Horowitz." I kept my eyes on his. "Your attorney called their office at 8:45 this morning. That means you knew about the investigation before yesterday, which means someone told you. That's also in the file." Garrett was very still. I reached into my coat. I drew out the trust document, for the 3rd time in 3 days, the same folded pages, the same March 14, 2019 header, and I set it against my palm and I held it where he could see it. "Dallas Ray Collier," I said. "Primary beneficiary. March 14, 2019. The same month you had my father sign the LLC operating agreement that was supposed to make this meaningless." I set the document on the narrow hallway shelf beside us, the one with the old pottery vase my grandmother had kept there, the one that had sat in that spot since before I was born, and I laid it flat. "It isn't meaningless. Because he was signing both documents at the same time. Because he didn't know about the LLC. Because you arranged it that way." Presley appeared at the top of the stairs. She stood there, one hand on the newel post, looking down at us. Her face was pale and very still. I looked up at her. Then I looked back at Garrett. "The DA will have the full operating agreement analysis by end of week," I said. "The notary journal request went out this morning through their office, not mine. The handwriting expert's preliminary report on the transfer signatures is already in the file." I paused. "And my mother is prepared to make a statement about the investment management fees." Garrett looked at the trust document on the shelf. He looked at the Horowitz letterhead. He looked at my name in the beneficiary line. He could read it from where he was standing in the narrow hallway with the cream and pale green wallpaper and the pottery vase. His face did not collapse. He was not a man whose face collapsed. But something went out of it, the quality of a man who is prepared for every variable and believes he has covered them all, leaving in patches, unevenly, until what remained was just his face. Not a villain's face. A man's face. Someone who had looked at a situation and found the angles and worked them, and who was now standing in a hallway looking at a document he had not accounted for, and a wife on a landing who was no longer looking at him the way she had been looking at him for 3 days. He looked up at Presley on the stairs. Presley, looking down at him from the landing, said, in a voice I had not heard from her before, flat and stripped of everything she had been maintaining for 3 days. "You told me it was airtight." Presley came down the stairs slowly. She passed me in the hallway without making eye contact, and she stopped beside Garrett, and she looked at the trust document on the shelf, and she read it the way I had watched other people read it over the past 3 days, with the focused, careful attention of someone who needs to be sure of what they're seeing before they react. She looked at my name in the beneficiary line. She looked at the date. She looked at her husband. "You told me the trust was old," she said. "You told me it was superseded. You told me the deed transfer was the correct document and the trust was a prior version that Dad had moved past." Garrett said, "Presley." "March 2019, she said. "He signed the trust in March 2019. He signed whatever you put in front of him in March 2019. Both of them. At the same time." "The LLC was a separate arrangement," Garrett said. "Your father understood what he was." "Did he?" Presley said. Her voice cracked slightly, not from emotion but from strain, the crack of something held in one position too long. "Because Horowitz says he called in October and asked questions about whether a deed transfer would supersede a trust. Which means 3 weeks before he went into the hospital, he was asking his estate attorney about instruments that should have been reconciled years ago. Which means he didn't know. Which means you let him not know." Garrett was very still. "You used me," Presley said. "You needed a grantee on the deed. You needed a family member's name on it so it looked like a family decision. You needed me to hand Dallas the envelope and stand there and say Dad wanted it this way." Her jaw tightened. "You needed me to be the face of it." "Everything I did," Garrett said, "I did for us." "No," Presley said. "You did it for the LLC. I was the instrument. Just like Dad was." The hallway was very quiet. The wallpaper. The pottery vase. The trust document laid flat on the shelf between all of us, my name in the beneficiary line, the date that had been there for 7 years waiting to matter. Garrett looked at the document for a long moment. He looked at the Horowitz letterhead. He looked at my name in the beneficiary line. He looked at Presley. He looked at me. He picked up his phone. He looked at the screen. His expression didn't change, but something shifted behind it, the quality of a man receiving information he has been waiting for and finding it worse than he'd hoped. He put the phone in his pocket. He went upstairs. Not through the back door, upstairs. We heard his footsteps, slow and deliberate, not the rapid exit of a man in full retreat, but the careful movement of someone who has decided, at least for the moment, that the room upstairs is safer than the hallway. Then the sound of the bedroom door. Then nothing. Presley and I stood in the hallway. The house held its particular silence, the furnace, the window frame, the pottery vase between us on the shelf, and the trust document still lying flat beside it. My name in the beneficiary line. The March 14, 2019 date. I thought about how many times I had unfolded this document in the past 3 days. In Horowitz's office, in Trevino's conference room, in the kitchen, in the hallway, and now here again, the same crease lines, the same Horowitz letterhead, the same beneficiary line that said what it had always said. I had carried it against my ribs for 3 days as though it were a thing that needed protecting, and I understood now that it had always been the other way. It had been protecting me. A document prepared in the light, by a man who had tried, in the only way he knew how, to say something he couldn't say out loud. Presley was looking at it. "He made me memorize the talking points," she said. "Garrett. He told me what Dad had said, and he told me how to present it, and he told me what to say if you pushed back. He'd had 3 months to prepare me. I had 48 hours after Dad went into the hospital to believe all of it was true." I looked at my sister. I thought about the black dress at the hillside burial. The steadiness of her eyes in the kitchen Friday evening, not her steadiness, I understood now, but the steadiness of the things she'd been told to say, which had held until the phone rang and the county recorder's office appeared on my screen. "He was counting on the geography," I said. "You hear me in Portland? He needed someone inside the family who could make it look like a family decision. He chose the one who was already here." Presley looked at me. "That's right," she said. "I think that's exactly right." "He needed you to believe it," I said. "Because you had to be convincing." She was quiet. Outside, a car passed on the road, the first sound from outside the property all morning. It passed and the road was quiet again. "When Dad called me in August and asked me to help," she said. I thought he was choosing me. I thought he was saying that I was the one who'd stayed close. That you'd left and I'd stayed and he was acknowledging that. She paused. I wanted it to be that. I sat with that. I thought about my father's management, the years of small separations, the slightly false picture we each had of what the other thought and felt. And I thought about how that distance had been useful to someone who needed us not to compare notes. He used what Dad had already built, I said. The distance between us. Presley looked at the trust document on the shelf. She was very quiet. I know, she said. I'm going to get my own attorney, she said. I already called Trevino from upstairs. Good, I said. She didn't go upstairs immediately. She stood in the hallway and looked at the floor for a moment, the way people look at floors when they are assembling themselves. Dad would have told you, she said. Eventually. I think that's what October was, him trying to figure out how to tell you. He called Horowitz in October. He was working up to something. She paused. He didn't get there in time. I thought about October. The call to Horowitz. The questions about deed transfers. 14 days between that conversation and his hospitalization. 3 days between the hospitalization and the date on the notary stamp. 3 days in which someone had moved very quickly, locking down a document that had been sitting ready, getting it filed before anyone could ask the right questions. I know, I said. She looked at me. Her face was tired in the same deep-seated way my mother's face was tired. The tiredness of people who have been carrying something for a long time and have only just been allowed to put it down, not all the way down but part way, far enough to feel the difference. She went upstairs. I picked up the trust document from the shelf and folded it along its crease lines and slid it back into my coat. I went to find my mother. She was in the kitchen as she always was, as she had been for 41 years in the early afternoon, the coffee cooling, the light moving through the east window, the double wedding ring quilt folded over the arm of her chair. She looked up when I came in. She looked at my face the way she had been looking at my face my whole life, not trying to read it exactly, just receiving it, the way you receive a letter from someone you know well enough that the words don't need translating. I sat down across from her at my father's table. Dora was there too. She had come back as promised, and was doing something quiet near the counter with the focused peripheral competence that made her presence feel like weather rather than intrusion. We sat together for a while without speaking. The light moved through the east window at its November angle, the low slant of it laying a rectangle of pale gold across the walnut surface of the table. My father had finished this table on a Tuesday in October, some years ago, I didn't remember which year, only that he had called me and said, I finished the table. Just that. And I had said, that's good, Dad. And the call had ended. That was how things were. I had thought many times since Friday about whether it is possible to miss something that never quite existed in the form you wished it had, and I thought now that the answer was yes, clearly, obviously, of course. What will you do? My mother asked. Let Horowitz file, I said. Talk to Trevino. See what the notary journal shows. I looked at the table's walnut surface, the grain my father had chosen, the finish his hands had applied. It will take time. It will, she said. Are you all right? I asked. With what's coming? She looked at the window. She looked at the yard, the frost long gone, the grass gold in the afternoon light. Your grandmother used to say that land keeps you honest, she said. I think she was right. My mother put her hand over mine. She kept it there. Outside the window the oak tree stood at its angle and the November light came through the kitchen the same way it had come through every November for as long as this house had been standing, and I let it mean what it meant. 3 months is a long time and it is not a long time. It is long enough for a court to receive a filing and schedule an initial hearing and for an attorney to build a record and for a criminal complaint to move from preliminary to formal. It is not long enough to stop waking up at 4 in the morning with the specific texture of that Thursday's kitchen table in your hands, the walnut grain, the trust document, your sister's face doing its recalculation. I went back to Portland after one more day. I sat with my mother and Dora and we talked about practical things, the house, the accounts, what would need to happen in the next month and the month after. I told my mother she should request the investment management fee records from whatever bank accounts she had access to, and she said she already had, the morning after I had told her about Trevino. I had not been surprised. I drove to the airport in the rental car. I flew back to Portland. I went back to work on Monday and sat in my project coordinator's chair and looked at municipal drainage specs and thought about the fact that the reliable plumbing of cities is more important than anyone acknowledges until something fails. I called Horowitz twice a week. I called Trevino once a week. I called my mother every day. The call came in at 8:17 on a Thursday morning, 11 weeks after I had stood at the graveside in the fog, in the coat with the loose lining I had finally taken to a tailor. She had fixed it in 20 minutes and charged me $12. I answered and Horowitz told me, in his careful, unhurried way, what the court had found. The trust instrument would be enforced. The property would be returned to the estate and administered per its terms, with me as primary beneficiary. The WC Holdings LLC operating agreement had been found to be an instrument of undue influence executed without the grantor's informed consent. The simultaneous signing with the trust, the absence of independent legal review, and the guided hand indicators on 4 of the transfer signatures had been sufficient for the court to set it aside. The deed transfer had already been withdrawn. Garrett Dade's criminal case was proceeding separately. 4 counts. His attorney had filed a motion the previous week that Trevino said was unlikely to succeed. Presley had been granted immunity in exchange for her full cooperation. She had called me once from her own phone 2 weeks after I had left Sebastopol. She had said, "I'm sorry." I had said, "I know." We had stayed on the line for a moment without speaking and then said goodbye. It was not nothing. It was also not everything. It was the beginning of something that would take longer than 3 months. "Understood," I said, and let it land like a period, not a comma. I smoothed my hand across the table, not my father's table, my table, a small second-hand oak piece I'd bought at an estate sale 6 years ago, and refinished myself, the grain running the wrong way for the light but right in all the ways that mattered. Horowitz said there would be more steps. There always were. I told him I understood and that I would be available, and we said goodbye. I set the phone on the table. I thought about what Garrett had said in the hallway, standing over the trust document, with Presley on the landing. She left and she stayed gone, and she doesn't get to come back and collect what she didn't earn. The 3rd time he had said it. The last time. I thought about how a sentence, spoken with certainty, can sound like truth until it is set beside a document that says otherwise. A document prepared in the light. March 14, 2019. Dallas Ray Collier, primary beneficiary. I thought about what my grandmother had said at the kitchen table, with her hand over mine and the coffee going cold between us. That was always going to be you. I thought about which of those 2 sentences had turned out to be true. I knew which one. I picked up my coffee. I looked out at the street below, the Alberta Street morning, the Vietnamese restaurant sign not yet lit, the particular quality of Portland light at 8 in November, different from Sonoma County light in ways I had never been able to fully name, but that had become, over 6 years, the light I recognized as mine. The light of the place I had built for myself in the years my father was elsewhere managing things in the dark. A Stellar's J landed on the windowsill. The same electric blue-black, the same proprietary attention, regarding the world with the certainty of a creature that knows exactly where it belongs. I looked at it. I thought about the J at the Sebastopol fence post, the one that had been there the morning my mother and I sat with coffee in the November kitchen, and she had not asked for help but had accepted it. I thought about how the same bird turns up in different windows and means the same thing in all of them. I didn't move. I let it sit there for as long as it wanted. This story is a work of fiction, inspired by real emotional truths many families carry. If this reminded you of your own family, tell me where you're watching from, and subscribe for the next one.